हिस्ट्री ऑफ फैशन डिजाइनिंग। प्रैक्टिकल तो हमने बहुत कर लिया, अब थोड़ा सा हम फैशन डिजाइनिंग की हिस्ट्री के बारे में जानेंगे कि हमारे ये जो क्लोथिंग स्टाइल है, जो फैशन है, वो कहाँ से आया है, कैसे डेवलप हुआ है, देन थ्रू आउट द ईयर इसमें क्या क्या चेंजेस हुए हैं, प्रेजेंट में हमारी क्लोथिंग स्टाइल क्या है, पास्ट में कैसी रही होगी, ब्रिटिश एरा में कैसी रही होगी, वो सभी चीज़ें इस वीडियोज़ में मैंने बहुत अच्छे से क्लियरली बताया है। एनिमेटेड वीडियो है जो आप लोग के लिए बहुत हेल्पफुल रहेगी। इसमें सारी चीज़ें डिटेल में मैंने कवर की है कि किस ईयर में, किस एराज़ में हमने कैसे फैशन को डेवलप किया है, क्या-क्या क्लोथिंग हमने अडॉप्ट की है और प्रेज़ेंट में हमारी जो क्लोथिंग स्टाइल है उसमें क्या-क्या चेंजेस हुए हैं, ट्रेंड कैसे पता चलता है, देन ट्रेंड चेंज कैसे होता है, वो सभी चीज़ें मैंने कवर की हैं। तो वीडियो को अंत तक ज़रूर देखिएगा, आप लोग के लिए बहुत हेल्पफुल रहेगी। ओके?
All right, let's get into it. Today, we're going to unzip the fascinating story of fashion and really see how what we wear has been telling the story of who we are for, well, thousands of years. But first, just take a quick look at what you're wearing right now. Seriously, is it for comfort? Is it for work? Are you trying to make a statement? Every single choice you made, whether you realized or not, is part of this long, dramatic history of self-expression. Because that's really the heart of it, right? Fashion has never been just about the clothes. It's always been this giant mirror reflecting our social structures, our values, our revolutions, and even our technology. So our story really kicks off in the ancient world. Back then, clothing was first and foremost about two things: what was practical and who was in charge. And you can see those two big ideas at play right here. For the ancient Egyptians, fashion was a product of their environment. They wore linen because, well, that's what they could grow. Made sense. Meanwhile, for groups like the Anglo-Saxons, clothing was a direct signal of status. Your outfit told everyone exactly where you stood in the social pecking order. Okay, so next, we're going to see how this whole idea of status gets cranked up to 11. We're moving into an era where fashion becomes less about necessity and way more about a spectacular and, let's be honest, kind of ridiculous display of power.
This quote just nails the mindset perfectly. In the royal courts of Europe, the aristocracy started developing styles that were deliberately impractical. Their elaborate, super restrictive clothing was basically a walking billboard that screamed, "I am so wealthy, I don't need to lift a finger."
And this obsession with impracticality led to some pretty wild inventions, all designed to completely distort the human body. For women in the 15th and 16th centuries, you had the farthingale. It was essentially a cage worn under a skirt just to create this massive cone-like shape.
And for the men, there was the codpiece, a decorative and, well, a very prominent piece of fabric attached right at the groin. It was making its own unique statement, for sure. And then, for both sexes, you had the ruff. This giant, stiff, pleated collar was an incredible symbol of wealth. Just think about the sheer amount of fabric and labor needed to make and maintain one of these. I mean, try eating soup in that. By the 1700s, this whole trend just hit its absolute peak. Hips were extended to absurd widths using hoops, and hair was piled into these enormous styles like the pompadour. This was a total spectacle of excess, and it was happening right on the brink of revolutions that were about to change everything. And that brings us to the modern era. This is where world wars, the rise of the working woman, and huge social movements would completely tear down and rebuild the entire world of fashion.
This timeline really shows you just how turbulent the 20th century was, and every single one of these events had a direct and often dramatic impact on what people wore every day.
But before all that chaos, you had the 1890s and this silhouette, the exaggerated hourglass. We're talking wide shoulders, a waist cinched mercilessly by a corset, and hips padded out with a bustle. This style perfectly reflected the rigid and restrictive social rules of the time.
Then World War I happened, and everything changed. The 1920s saw a complete rebellion against that restrictive past. The ideal figure became this tubular, boyish silhouette of the flopper. Bras were even introduced to flatten the chest, not enhance it. And you had designers like Coco Chanel leading the charge, saying things like, "Each frill discarded makes one look younger." It was a fashion revolution. But just as fashion found this new sense of freedom, another global conflict came along and slammed the brakes on, again. During World War II, clothing wasn't about style at all. It was about patriotism and conservation.
Governments actually put strict laws into place, like the L-85 law in the US. And these weren't suggestions, they were rules. Ruffles were forbidden, you could only have one pocket on your blouse, hems were limited to 2 inches. It basically forced fashion into this tiny box of pure utility.
So you can imagine, when the war finally ended, the backlash was immediate and, frankly, glorious. In 1947, Christian Dior unveiled his new look, and it was a direct, defiant rebellion against all those years of austerity.
It had these beautiful, sloping shoulders and extravagantly full skirts that used yards and yards of fabric. It was a signal that femininity and luxury were back.
And this really set the stage for a cultural tug-of-war. The 1950s leaned into this new excess, with fashion reflecting conformity, the baby boom, and traditional gender roles. Then, the 1960s happened, and the youthquake just blew all of that apart, with miniskirts, unisex clothing, and styles pulled right from the civil rights and anti-war movements.
This explosion of self-expression in the 60s kicked off a totally new era. For the first time, really, there wasn't just one dominant trend, there were dozens of them, all existing at the exact same time. The decades that followed were just a whirlwind of competing subcultures. The 70s gave us disco-driven bell-bottoms and leisure suits. The 80s, totally fueled by MTV and the fitness craze, was an era of power suits and big hair. Then the 90s came along and reacted against all that with the stripped-down, anti-fashion grunge look. You can see how each decade was a clear reaction to the one before it. And that brings us to the 21st century, which really kicked off what you could call a great retro cycle. So much of modern fashion is about borrowing, mixing, and reinterpreting all the hits from the past for a new generation.
Which, of course, leaves us with one final question. In our world of instant trends, fast fashion, and even digital clothing for our online avatars, what will the clothes of the future say about us? What kind of story are they gonna tell?